Hi everybody, welcome to our lecture for EDLE 6493 in our Fullan text. This is chapter 13 and we're going to be focusing on the last couple chapters in the book that are really engaged in large school reform. So one of the things that I have to mention, because it's obviously come up in discussion in the course and it's something that you cannot get past when you're looking at what this course is, you have to realize that this course and this textbook is looking at urban schools, and our author, Michael Fullan, he's the Canadian Idol when it comes to education. So the research does lean towards British models of education. This is non-transferable to the United States fully, but there are elements of it that can be transferred to the United States. I want to stress that the Education Reform Act of 1988 is very much what No Child Left Behind was in the United States and England. So it's one of the major reforms in the history of education in the entire world. So knowing it and understanding it, I'll briefly go over it, but you need to know what it means. The big thing that happened in England, and it worked its way throughout all European schools, were that schools needed more autonomy. They needed the ability to choose their vision, their mission at the district level and at the building level, and parents needed school choice as well. So parents had the right to manage education quality and make choices, and they made a single national curriculum. We know in the United States this notion and this idea would, force more controversy than you can imagine. And teaching this class, remember the perspective that I told you on day one that I'm coming from. I am a believer in state control of education. I'm not a believer in local control. I'm not a believer in national control. I think there's a reason why powers in the United States Constitution have been delegated to the states, and I believe in supporting the Constitution. So my belief in schools are that a single state curriculum is good, but a national curriculum would be a problem. And once again, do students in Louisiana have the same need that students in Vermont have? Do students in California have the same need that students in Hawaii have? Try to think about that when you're trying to make the argument between a national or a statewide curriculum. So large-scale global reform, in every other country, education is regulated at the federal level. So when you're looking at these models, you have to tell yourself that, hey, there's a reason why this is federally driven, because truthfully education is regulated at the federal level in almost every other country. So change in education itself is saying that I'm going to change something. It's very easy to do. I don't want you to get the wrong idea and think that change is not easy. But the problem is it happens, and then the districts are kind of at snap of a finger. Then they have to deal with whatever change the state or the federal government makes, and then they're left in the wake of kind of those procedures. So you have to have ways that this change can actually lead to more improvement in change schools for the better, and you have to be warned of it. In the example that I'm always going to present in here, and I'll present it in every single one of the classes that I teach from now until the day that I die, is this idea of the teacher evaluation system getting rolled out in Oklahoma. The overnight purpose of doing that it just floored me how quickly it got rolled out and how little feedback stakeholders had. And it was such a large change in a large system that I think if it would have been grandfathered in more, we would have had more success with it, and the same with Common Core in the state of Oklahoma as well. I believe in Common Core. I've seen Common Core work in other states. So to me, it does work. So I think it's important. So some premises for reframing schools at the national level. I give you 7 ideas. This notion of having targets, having motivation, having multi-level engagement, having capacity building, focusing on strategies, using resource, and keeping things transparent. They're all important, and we've covered all of these throughout this course. So I like the idea of less is more. Less targets is a million times better. If you try to fix everything at the same time, that leads to frustration, burnout, and failure to achieve. Where if you have more focus on only a few targets and a few things to reform your school system, you are going to do a much better job, and I firmly believe that. Goals have to be clear to the public, and they have to be transparent. They have to be able to be measured. And if they don't, then we have an issue and we have a problem as well. And the Polycom is dialing in on us right now. So hi everybody, I'm still filming. So if you're seeing this, you're seeing class. Let me move back over there. So those targets should not always be the focus. Once they've been mastered, you add more goals and you reform the goals as needed. So you have to make sure that education is looked upon positively and the reform that you're doing is done in a positive manner. And once again, we've heard failing schools, failing schools, failing schools. You need to make sure that improvement is led to improve schools for the better and it's led for the positive. And the teachers and principals have a positive mindset when they're looking at schools and they're looking at school improvement. So motivation can't be built in the short run. It has to be done over time and it has to be done with stakeholders that have been engaged for a long period of time and stakeholders that are present and visible in the school system and that have a shared common vision of how schools work and how schools should be looked upon. I don't believe you point out flaws of people. I think you have to address the positives and work on the flaws as motivation is being built. The government will say that initiative and reform has to happen, but in all honesty, really this comes down to you and who you are in your building, in your district, and your ability to engage with those stakeholders. I hope and I believe that when systems work properly, you have good state leadership and good national leadership, but we all know that sometimes it's an elected official, sometimes it's somebody that's appointed who might not have a good vision of what they supposedly think could benefit schools. So capacity building, every school has to have a way to build capacity and keep these reforms and keep these initiatives going. It has to be sustainable and it has to include your basic competencies, knowledge, resources, and motivation within the organization. So I like the idea of focusing on strategies for the long haul. It relates once again to strategic planning. What does my school look like in 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, or 10 years? But there is going to be turnover. We know that the average building principal does not last in their position for longer than 5 years. Because of that, the key strategies have to be embedded in the culture. There has to be good succession planning and good people coming up through the pipeline that could be leaders. And the leaders have to make sure that the goals and strategies are presented appropriately as well. So anytime I teach finance, which is one of my primary areas, that and organizational theory, I truly believe that there's this notion of transparency that has to exist. You have to keep everything open to all stakeholders, all community members, and the public. And if you're open books and open source and everything, everybody's on the same page and they know what's going on. If you work in an organization that isn't transparent, it will make you disloyal to the organization, and that will cause more issues and challenges than you want to deal with. So money's important, and you have to make sure that money comes into schools and comes into the school system. It's really a way to show that you're committed to a reform. You're committed to a grant project that's coming through if it's being funded financially for a lot of reasons. It can be used to help change schools, and it can be used to really inform and help practices, and also transparency as well, because if initiatives are getting funded significantly, that can be good and it can be bad if people know how much they're getting funded, because then they can at least give their input and see the progress based off of a massive grant that comes into the district. But don't forget about the resources that exist and the funding sources that are there, even as new ones come in. So the use of change knowledge is not a quick fix. It has to be clear, and it has to be used that's driven in data and driven in research and in effective practice. And I think that goes without saying, but we have to have people that are educationally prepared, which is why all of you are in these positions and why you're taking the classes that you are. So the last chapter that we're going to look at in the Fullan text really looks at the economy, and you can't have education reform without the economy. So we're going to talk about that as we enter the last chapter in Fullan, and we'll go over kind of the economic drivers. So if you have any questions, as always, please let me know. Thank you.